Some strangers arrive carrying trouble. Others arrive carrying the kind of silence that changes a man forever. The first time Elias Mercer saw the Apache woman, the desert wind was dragging dust across his ranch like smoke over a battlefield. Sundown painted the Arizona sky the color of old copper, and the horses inside the corral had gone strangely still. That was what made him look up from the broken fence post in his hands. Horses always sensed danger before men did. She came riding out of the heat haze alone, moving slow, swaying slightly in the saddle, as if every mile had cost her something painful. Her dark hair clung to her face, and one sleeve of her buckskin dress had turned darker from dried blood and desert dust. Elias narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. Out there, 20 miles from the nearest town, nobody rode alone unless they were desperate, foolish, or being hunted. Sometimes all three. The woman stopped near the water trough, but didn't climb down from the horse right away. She studied the ranch first. The weathered barn. The windmill squeaking against the evening breeze. The old black dog sleeping beneath the porch. Then her eyes found Elias standing near the fence line with a hammer hanging loose in one hand. There was no fear in her face, only exhaustion held together by stubborn pride. "You Elias Mercer?" she asked quietly. Her English carried a soft Apache accent, smooth and steady like river stones underwater. Elias didn't answer immediately. Folks in town called him many things. Widower, drifter, half-mad rancher living too far from civilized land. But hearing his own name from a stranger somehow felt heavier than usual. "Depends who's asking," he said. The woman slowly slid off the horse, though her knees nearly gave out when her boots touched the dirt. She hid the weakness quickly, but Elias noticed. Men who spent their lives working cattle learned to notice small things. A limping horse, a shaking hand, eyes that hadn't slept in days. She stepped closer, keeping one hand near the leather pouch hanging against her chest beneath the folds of her shawl. Not protective exactly, more like terrified someone might take it from her. "My name is Nyelli," she said. "I need a place to stay for 6 days." Elias glanced toward the horizon behind her. Empty desert, red rocks glowing in the dying sunlight. No riders yet. But the desert had a way of hiding trouble until it stood breathing at your fence gate. "Why 6?" he asked. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not fear. Sadness. Deep and quiet. The kind that settles into a person's bones. "Because on the 7th day," she whispered, "I have to leave." The windmill groaned above them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low behind the mountains, even though the sky was clear. Elias looked at the blood staining her sleeve again. Fresh enough to matter. He should have turned her away right then. A white rancher sheltering an Apache woman in 1878 Arizona territory was the sort of mistake that could get a man run out of town, or worse, left completely alone when trouble finally arrived. And trouble always arrived eventually. But then the old black dog beneath the porch stood up slowly, walked straight toward Nyelli, and rested its head against her hand. Elias stared. That dog hated strangers. Had bitten 2 mailmen and a preacher last winter. Yet now it stood beside her calmly, tail brushing through the dust. Nyelli closed her eyes for one brief second as her fingers touched the dog's fur, almost like she hadn't felt kindness in a very long time. And for reasons Elias couldn't explain, that small moment unsettled him more than the blood, the silence, or the strange request ever could. That night, the desert turned cold fast. The kind of cold that crept through the cracks in old ranch houses and settled deep into tired bones. Elias sat across from Nyelli at the small wooden table near the stove while rain tapped softly against the windows. The kerosene lamp between them flickered every time the wind pushed against the walls. She had not touched much of the stew he made. Just coffee, black and slow, both hands wrapped around the tin cup like she needed the warmth more than the drink itself. Elias noticed she kept glancing toward the windows every few minutes. Listening. Waiting. "You expecting somebody?" he finally asked. Nyelli looked at him over the rim of the cup. Her dark eyes reflected the lamp light in sharp little pieces. "Everybody is expecting somebody out here," she said quietly. "The question is whether they arrive smiling." Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Up close, she looked younger than he first thought. Maybe 26. 27 at most. But her eyes carried the weight of someone who had spent years surviving things she never spoke about. The silence between them stretched comfortably for a while. Outside, thunder rolled far across the valley. Then Elias noticed her hand trembling slightly near the coffee cup. Not from fear, from exhaustion. "You should let me see that arm," he said. Nyelli immediately pulled the sleeve closer against herself. "It is nothing. Nothing does not bleed through buckskin." Her jaw tightened at that. For a second, he thought she might walk straight back into the storm rather than accept help. Pride was common in the territory, but wounded pride was the most dangerous kind. Finally, without another word, she rolled the sleeve back slowly. Elias exhaled under his breath. The cut along her upper arm was not deep, but it had been poorly wrapped with torn cloth and desert herbs. The skin around it looked angry and swollen from 2 days riding through heat and dust. Elias stood, crossed the room, and pulled down the old medical tin from a shelf near the stove. Nyelli watched every movement carefully, like someone used to betrayal arriving disguised as kindness. "This is going to sting," he muttered. "I have survived worse. Most people who say that usually have." He cleaned the wound gently, while rain hammered harder against the roof overhead. Nyelli never flinched once. That unsettled him almost as much as the blood. Folks who spent their whole lives avoiding pain reacted differently than people who had learned to live beside it. "Who taught you English?" Elias asked quietly while wrapping fresh bandages around her arm. "A missionary woman near Fort Apache. Long time ago." "You trust missionaries?" For the first time that evening, the corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. "No," she said softly. "But I trusted her." The room fell quiet again. The old clock near the stairs ticked steadily while shadows shifted across the walls from the stove fire. Then Nyelli's eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting crooked on the shelf above the fireplace. Elias noticed immediately. A woman in a pale blue dress stared back from the picture beside a younger version of Elias standing stiffly in his Sunday coat. "Your wife?" Nyelli asked carefully. Elias nodded once. "Her name was Clara. She is gone." It was not really a question. Elias rested both hands against the table and stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. 7 winters now." Nyelli lowered her eyes respectfully. Out in the territory, grief recognized grief without needing many words. Then suddenly the old black dog near the porch door lifted its head and growled low in its throat. Elias turned toward the window instantly. Hoofbeats. Faint. Far away, but coming closer through the storm. The sound came through the storm slow at first, almost swallowed by thunder and rain. But Elias Mercer had lived too many years in open country to mistake hoofbeats for anything else. Riders. More than 2. Maybe 4. Maybe 6. The old black dog stood near the door now, ears raised, a low growl rolling deep in its chest. Nyelli did not move at all. That bothered Elias more than panic would have. People only stayed that calm when fear had already become familiar. Elias crossed to the window carefully and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the muddy trail leading toward the ranch. Lightning flashed across the valley for half a second, turning the desert silver. Empty. Then darkness swallowed everything again. "Friends of yours?" he asked without looking back. Behind him, the stove crackled softly. Nyelli stared into the fire, her fingers wrapped tightly around the leather pouch hanging beneath her shawl. No, one word. Quiet. Certain. Elias let the curtain fall back into place. "You planning to tell me why men are riding through a thunderstorm looking for you?" Nyelli finally looked up at him. Rainwater still glistened faintly in her dark hair from earlier, and the firelight painted soft gold along the sharp edges of her face. "If I tell you," she said carefully, "you may ask me to leave tonight." Elias rested one shoulder against the wall near the window. "And if you do not tell me, I might still ask." For a moment, she almost smiled again. Sadder this time, like she respected honesty even when it cornered her. Outside, the hoofbeats faded for a while, circling somewhere beyond the ridge east of the barn. Watching. Waiting. Nyelli lowered her eyes toward the pouch at her chest. 3 weeks ago, she said softly, a trader arrived near my people's winter camp. He carried medicine, blankets, ammunition. He also carried lies. Elias stayed silent. Men revealed more when nobody interrupted them. Or women did. He wanted land near the canyon river, Nyelli continued. The elders refused him. That river belongs to Apache families older than memory. Thunder rolled low again. The trader did not like hearing no. Elias noticed her hand tighten around the pouch again. What was his name? Silas Grady. Elias frowned slightly. He knew the name. Everybody within 50 miles knew it. Silver mines. Railroads. Freight wagons moving through 3 territories. Men like Silas Grady never dirted their hands personally. They paid other people to create fear for them. What does that have to do with you? Nyelli looked toward the window then, as if checking the darkness itself before answering. Because 2 nights later, one of Grady's men came secretly to my father. Her voice softened at the word father. He warned us. Said Grady planned to force the tribe away from the river before winter. Elias crossed slowly back toward the table. And this pouch? Nyelli hesitated, long enough for the rain on the roof to fill the silence. Then she reached beneath the shawl and carefully pulled the pouch free. It was old brown leather, worn smooth by years of handling. Smaller than Elias expected. About the size of a man's hand. Tied shut with faded red cord. Inside this pouch, she whispered, is proof that Silas Grady forged land papers with the sheriff from Dry Creek County. Elias felt his jaw tighten slightly. You are telling me a railroad man and a sheriff are chasing you through the desert over paperwork? Nyelli met his eyes directly. Men kill for gold. They kill faster for land. Another flash of lightning lit the room bright white for 1 sharp second. And in that instant, Elias saw something in Nyelli's face that unsettled him deeply. She was not afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for him. Then suddenly the horses outside the barn began stomping nervously, and from somewhere beyond the storm came the faint glow of lantern light moving through the rain. The lantern lights moved slowly beyond the rain like drifting ghosts between the mesquite trees. Elias counted 3 at first. Then a 4th appeared farther back near the ridge line. Riders spreading out. Not travelers searching for shelter. Men searching for something specific. The horses inside the barn stamped nervously again, leather tack creaking softly in the dark. Elias reached for the rifle resting beside the door without taking his eyes off the window. Behind him, Nyelli stood very still near the stove fire. They found me faster than I thought, she whispered. Elias checked the rifle calmly, though something heavy had already settled into his chest. Trouble always arrived eventually. The territory had taught him that years ago. What surprised him now was not the danger outside. It was how quickly he had stopped thinking about sending her away. How many, he asked. Nyelli stepped beside him carefully, keeping herself away from the lights spilling through the windows. For tonight, she said softly. Maybe more by morning. Rainwater slid down the glass in crooked lines while thunder echoed low across the desert. Elias watched one lantern pause near the outer fence line. The rider did not approach closer, just sat there in the storm, studying the ranch house through the rain. Waiting. You know them? Elias asked. Nyelli nodded once. 2 worked for Grady. One used to wear a deputy badge. Used to. Her expression darkened slightly. Some men stopped serving the law long before they stopped wearing it. Elias let out a quiet breath through his nose. That sounded true enough for Arizona territory. Outside, lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the riders through the storm. Long coats. Wide hats pulled low. One man sat unnaturally stiff in the saddle, like an old injury had hardened his spine. Nyelli saw him too. Her fingers tightened instantly around the leather pouch. That one, she whispered. The tall rider near the cedar post. What about him? For the first time since arriving, real fear crossed her face. Small, sharp, honest. His name is Warren Pike. Elias looked at her carefully. You afraid of him? Nyelli stayed silent for several seconds. Then she answered in a voice barely louder than the rain. No, I am afraid of what follows him. The dog near the door growled again, lower this time. Elias rested one hand gently against the animal's neck to calm him. You planning to explain that? Nyelli moved toward the stove slowly, shadows shifting across her face in the firelight. 3 years ago, Warren Pike rode with soldiers near Red Mesa. They forced Apache families from winter camps before the first snow. Her voice remained calm, but Elias noticed she had stopped blinking as often. Like memory itself had become something painful to look at directly. My younger brother disappeared during that winter. Silence filled the room after that. Heavy silence. The kind that did not need more words. Outside, one of the riders finally nudged his horse forward through the mud toward the ranch gate. Elias straightened slightly near the window. The rider stopped about 30 feet from the porch. Did not dismount. Did not shout. He simply lifted one gloved hand slowly toward the house, then pointed directly at the window where the lantern light glowed inside. Nyelli stepped backward immediately into the darker corner of the room. "They know I am here now," she whispered. Elias watched the rider for another long second before pulling the curtain shut completely. Then hiding is finished. He crossed toward the coat rack near the door and grabbed his oilskin jacket. Nyelli stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Talking. Men like Warren Pike do not come to talk." Elias pulled on the jacket slowly, his weathered face unreadable beneath the low lamp light. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but this is still my land, and I figure a man ought to meet trouble standing up before it decides to walk through his front door." Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold rain while the riders waited silently beyond the storm. Rain soaked through Elias Mercer's jacket within seconds as he stepped onto the porch. The cold wind carried the smell of wet dirt, horses, and distant lightning rolling across the valley. Beyond the fence line, four riders waited motionless in the storm, their lanterns glowing faint gold through the darkness. The man nearest the gate sat taller than the others, broad shoulders hidden beneath a long black coat darkened by rain. Warren Pike. Elias could feel the weight of the man's stare even from 30 feet away. Some men carried danger loudly. Others carried it quietly enough to make silence itself uncomfortable. Warren Pike belonged to the second kind. Elias rested one hand against the porch post and looked out across the muddy yard. "Bit late for visitors," he called calmly. One of the riders shifted slightly in his saddle, but Warren Pike remained perfectly still. "We are looking for a woman," he finally said. His voice was low and rough like gravel dragged across wood. "Apache, traveling alone." Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of Elias's hat. "A lot of land between here and New Mexico," he replied. "You planning to search every ranch in the territory tonight?" For a moment, only thunder answered. Then Pike nudged his horse forward a few slow steps toward the porch gate. "Maybe only the ranch is foolish enough to hide her." Inside the house, Nyelli stood just beyond the window where the lantern light could not reach her face. She could hear every word through the storm. Her hand stayed pressed tightly against the leather pouch beneath her shawl while the old black dog paced nervously near the stove. Elias watched Pike carefully. Years ago, before grief hollowed him out into a quieter man, Elias had spent cattle seasons around gamblers, drifters, railroad guards, and lawmen. He had learned something useful. Dangerous men smiled less. Warren Pike had not smiled once. "You got legal papers for this search?" Elias asked. One rider behind Pike laughed softly under his breath. Pike ignored him. "You know who Silas Grady is?" Pike asked instead. Elias gave a slow nod. "Hard not to. Man buys half the territory one railroad tie at a time. Then you understand why crossing him is expensive." Lightning cracked across the valley again, bright enough to reveal Pike's face clearly for the first time. Mid-40s maybe. Deep scar near the jawline. Pale eyes that looked almost colorless beneath the rain. But what unsettled Elias most was the sheriff's silver badge hanging from Pike's belt beside his holster. Not polished. Not official-looking. Old. Stained dark around the edges. Like something buried too long beneath bad memories. Pike noticed Elias staring at it. "Dry Creek County," he said quietly. "Deputy Sheriff. Long time ago. And now." Pike looked briefly toward the ranch house windows glowing behind Elias. "Now I solve different kinds of problems." Silence settled over the yard again. Rain hammered against the barn roof while the horses shifted restlessly in the mud. Elias could feel Nyelli listening from inside the house, even without seeing her. "You know," Elias finally said, "most folks ride with lanterns when they are lost. Men riding through storms after one wounded woman usually are not lost." One corner of Pike's mouth moved slightly. Not a smile. Something colder. "Careful, rancher. Curiosity ages a man fast out here." Elias leaned casually against the porch rail. "So does lying." The rider beside Pike suddenly reached inside his coat, and the horses near the barn reacted instantly, snorting nervously. Elias stiffened slightly, but the man only pulled out a folded piece of paper protected beneath oilcloth. Pike took it from him and held it up. "Silas Grady is offering $500 for information leading to the recovery of stolen property." Elias frowned. "Property?" Pike's pale eyes lifted slowly toward the dark house behind him. "A leather pouch. Inside the ranch house, Nyelli closed her eyes briefly as thunder rolled overhead. Then Pike spoke one final sentence, calm enough to make the rain feel colder. "And if the woman carrying it is inside this house, rancher, tonight is your last chance to stay out of this." The rain kept falling long after Warren Pike and his riders disappeared back into the darkness beyond the ridge. Elias Mercer stood alone on the porch for several seconds after the lantern lights vanished, listening to the storm and the fading sound of horses moving through mud. Something about Pike unsettled him in ways he did not like admitting. Not because the man threatened him. Threats were simple. Men like Pike were worse. Calm, patient, certain. Elias finally stepped back inside and shut the door against the wind. Warmth from the stove rolled across the room again, carrying the scent of wet leather, coffee, and wood smoke. Nyelli still stood near the shadows by the staircase, her face pale beneath the flickering lantern light. "They will come back," she said quietly. Elias removed his soaked jacket slowly and hung it near the stove. "Probably. You should let me leave before sunrise." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The wound in her arm, the exhaustion hidden behind pride, the way her hand never drifted far from the leather pouch. Out in the territory, people lied often with their words. Fear usually told the truth first. "You said 6 days," Elias replied. "It has only been 1. Nyelli stared at him like she did not understand the answer. Maybe she truly did not. Trust came harder to people who spent too much of life surviving. The old black dog circled twice near the stove before finally settling down beside her boots again. Elias noticed it immediately. "You know," he muttered, "that dog spent 6 years hating everybody." Nyelli glanced down at the animal resting against her feet. Her expression softened slightly. "Animals listen better than people. That is because animals do not pretend to be civilized." A faint breath escaped her then, almost laughter, small enough that Elias nearly missed it beneath the rain. He had not realized how quiet the ranch had become these past 7 years until that sound touched the room. Strange thing about loneliness. A man stopped noticing it after long enough, until suddenly somebody sat across from him at supper and reminded him silence had weight. Elias poured fresh coffee into 2 tin cups while thunder rumbled farther west now, moving slowly across the mountains. Nyelli accepted the cup carefully this time. "Why do you live this far from town?" she asked after a while. Elias leaned back in the wooden chair near the stove, staring into the dark liquid inside his cup. "Because people ask fewer questions out here. That is not the real reason." Her voice remained gentle, but certain. Elias gave a dry smile without humor. "You Apache always this direct?" "Only when truth matters." The stove crackled softly between them. Finally, Elias nodded once toward the photograph above the fireplace. "After Clara died, folks in town looked at me different." Nyelli listened quietly, like they expected grief to end on schedule. "Men slapped my shoulder, told me time heals things." He rubbed one weathered hand slowly against the coffee cup. "Funny thing is, time mostly just teaches people how to carry pain quieter." Nyelli lowered her eyes slightly at that, like she understood too well. Outside, the storm began easing at last. Rain softened against the roof into a steady whisper. Somewhere far across the valley, a coyote called once into the darkness. Then Nyelli spoke again, softer than before. "My father used to say lonely people recognize each other before anybody else does." Elias looked up from the cup. Their eyes met across the dim room for a long moment. No romance in it. No softness meant for songs. Just 2 tired souls recognizing something familiar in the other. Then suddenly the horses outside snorted sharply near the barn. Elias stiffened immediately. The dog lifted its head. Nyelli turned toward the window. This time there were no lanterns. No voices. Only movement. A single rider crossing silently along the far ridge beneath the fading storm clouds, watching the ranch from a distance before disappearing again into the night. Morning arrived gray and cold over the Arizona Valley. Rainwater still clung to the fence posts, and low clouds hung heavy above the distant mountains like tired smoke. Elias Mercer had been awake since before sunrise, standing near the corral with a bucket of feed in one hand while the horses shifted restlessly around him. They sensed it too. The ranch no longer felt quiet. Trouble had a way of lingering in the air after men like Warren Pike rode through. Elias scattered grain into the mud and glanced toward the ridge where the lone rider had appeared during the night. Empty now? But empty country did not always mean safe country. Behind him, The ranch house door opened softly. Nyelli stepped onto the porch wrapped in one of Elias's old wool coats. It hung loose around her shoulders, sleeves slightly too long for her hands. The morning wind caught strands of her dark hair as she looked out across the wet valley. For a moment neither spoke. The world felt strangely still after the storm. Then Nyelli noticed the small wooden cross near the fence line beyond the barn. Simple, weathered, half surrounded by desert grass. "That is where she rests," she said quietly. Elias followed her gaze. "Clara's grave." "Yeah." Nyelli walked a few slow steps off the porch, stopping near the edge of the muddy yard. She did not ask permission. Somehow that felt respectful in its own way. "You still talk to her?" she asked softly. Elias let out a faint breath through his nose. "Sometimes." "And does she answer?" A dry smile crossed his face for half a second. "Not nearly as often as I deserve." Nyelli looked toward the grave again. "My people believe the dead stay close while they are still remembered." Elias rested both forearms against the corral fence. "Then Clara probably gets tired of hearing me complain." That small, almost smile appeared on Nyelli's face again. Faint, careful, like sunlight breaking through winter clouds for only a moment before disappearing. The old black dog trotted across the yard and settled near her boots once more. Elias shook his head slowly. "I still cannot believe he likes you. Maybe he knows I am leaving soon." The words landed heavier than she intended. Elias looked at her quietly. "You keep talking about leaving like it is already decided." Nyelli lowered her eyes toward the mud. "Some roads only go one direction." Before Elias could answer, the distant sound of wagon wheels drifted across the valley road. Both of them turned instinctively. A supply wagon rolled slowly toward the ranch from the direction of town, pulled by two tired mules splashing through shallow puddles. Elias frowned immediately. "That is strange. You know them?" "No deliveries due this week." As the wagon approached closer, Nyelli's expression changed. Subtle, sharp. She stepped backward slightly toward the porch shadows. "What?" Elias asked quietly. "The driver," she whispered. "I saw him once outside Grady's rail office." Elias narrowed his eyes toward the approaching wagon. Older man, gray hat, bent shoulders, harmless looking at first glance, which usually meant nothing. Out in the territory, the most dangerous men often dressed like ordinary ones. The wagon finally stopped near the front gate with a squeal of wet wheels. The driver tipped his hat politely. "Morning," he called. "Looking for Elias Mercer." Elias stepped forward slowly while Nyelli remained near the porch behind him. "Depends who is asking." The old driver smiled thinly and reached beneath the wagon seat. "Not for a weapon. For a small wooden box wrapped carefully in cloth." "Message for you," the man said. "Paid extra to make sure it arrived before noon." Elias approached cautiously and took the box. It was lighter than expected. No markings except one burned symbol carved into the lid. A railroad spike crossed over a sheriff's badge. Nyelli went pale the instant she saw it. "Do not open it," she whispered immediately. But Elias already had one thumb beneath the latch. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the lid. Inside rested only two things. A silver deputy badge stained dark around the edges, and one folded piece of paper with 6 words written across it in heavy black ink. "You have 5 days left now." The paper felt heavier than it should have in Elias Mercer's hands. Rain clouds still hung low above the valley, turning the morning light pale and cold, while the supply wagon creaked softly near the gate. The old driver avoided looking directly at either of them now. That alone told Elias enough. Men who carried ordinary messages usually spoke more comfortably. "Who gave you this?" Elias asked. The driver swallowed once beneath his gray beard. "Man paid cash in Dry Creek. Said I was not to ask questions." "Did he give a name?" "No, sir." The old man shifted uneasily on the wagon seat. "But everybody in town knows whose riders wear that symbol now." Elias glanced back down at the wooden box. Railroad spike crossed over a sheriff's badge. Not a gang mark exactly. More like a warning. A reminder that law and money had started sleeping in the same bed out here. Nyelli stepped slowly closer from the porch, her dark eyes fixed on the stained deputy badge inside the box. Elias noticed the color drained slightly from her face again. "You know whose badge this was," he said quietly. Nyelli nodded once. "Deputy Aaron Bell." "Friend of yours?" "No," her voice softened. "But he tried to help us." Wind pushed across the wet valley, rattling the loose chain hanging near the barn doors. The old driver shifted his mules impatiently. He clearly wanted distance from the ranch as quickly as possible. Smart man. 3 months ago, Nyelli continued quietly. Aaron Bell discovered forged land records hidden inside the Dry Creek courthouse. Elias looked toward her carefully. The same records inside your pouch. Yes. She wrapped the wool coat tighter around herself. He planned to deliver copies to a federal judge in Prescott. The old driver removed his hat slowly. Folks said Bell disappeared near Red Basin. Nyelli lowered her eyes. He did not disappear. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy silence. The kind that carried unfinished truths inside it. Elias closed the wooden box carefully and handed it back toward the wagon driver. Take this thing with you. The old man blinked in surprise. You sure? Very. The driver wasted no time. He grabbed the box quickly, snapped the reins, and rolled the wagon away down the muddy trail faster than a man his age normally moved. Elias watched until the wagon vanished beyond the ridge. Then he turned toward Nyelli. You think Pike sent that message? Nyelli stared toward the empty road. No, why not? Because Warren Pike does not threaten people twice. A chill moved through Elias that had nothing to do with weather. The old dog wandered slowly beside Nyelli again, pressing against her leg while she stood motionless in the yard. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled against the gray sky. Then who sent it? Elias asked quietly. Nyelli hesitated. For the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain whether to speak at all. Finally she answered. Silas Grady has a son. Elias frowned slightly. Did not know that. Most people do not. She looked toward the distant mountains as she spoke. His name is Daniel Grady. He runs the railroad camps farther south. And Nyelli's fingers tightened around the wool coat. Daniel believes fear works better than bullets. He warns people before he destroys them. Elias stared toward the ridge line thoughtfully. 5 days left now, which meant whoever sent the message believed Nyelli planned to stay 6. They were watching closer than he realized. You should still leave, Nyelli whispered suddenly. Every hour I remain here makes this worse for you. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Wind moved softly through the wet grass between them. Then he nodded once toward the ranch house behind her. Funny thing, he said quietly. This place has been dead silent for 7 years. Nyelli looked confused. Elias gave a tired half-smile beneath the brim of his hat. Now there are riders in the hills, strange messages at my gate, and a woman arguing with me before breakfast. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Nyelli laughed softly. Real laughter this time. Small, brief, honest enough to surprise both of them. But the moment vanished quickly when Elias noticed something far beyond the valley road. 3 dark riders standing motionless along the distant ridge again, watching the ranch through the morning fog. And this time, one of them was carrying a white flag. The 3 riders remained motionless on the ridge while the white flag snapped softly in the morning wind. Fog drifted low through the valley grass, wrapping around the horses' legs like pale smoke. Elias Mercer narrowed his eyes beneath his hat brim, studying the men carefully. White flags usually meant peace. Out in Arizona territory, they sometimes meant something worse. Nyelli stood beside him near the porch steps, silent now, all traces of laughter gone from her face. The old black dog pressed close against her boots again, ears lowered uneasily toward the distant ridge. Do you know them? Elias asked quietly. Nyelli stared hard at the riders for several long seconds before answering. No, her voice tightened slightly. But one of them knows me. That answer settled heavily between them. The rider holding the white flag finally nudged his horse forward alone, descending the muddy slopes slowly while the other 2 remained behind near the ridge. No rush. No visible weapons drawn. The confidence of a man certain he would be heard. Elias rested one hand loosely near the porch rail as the rider approached within 40 feet of the ranch gate. Younger than Warren Pike. Clean-shaven. Expensive black coat beneath a rain cape. Not a working man's posture either. This man sat a horse like somebody taught from childhood rather than necessity. Elias Mercer? The rider called politely. His voice carried smooth eastern manners polished far away from cattle dust and desert storms. Who was asking? Elias replied. The rider removed one glove carefully before speaking again. Daniel Grady. Nyelli's shoulders stiffened beside Elias instantly. So this was the son. The man who preferred fear over force. Daniel Grady smiled faintly when he noticed her standing near the porch. Not warm. Not cruel either. Somehow colder than both. Miss Nyelli, he said softly. You have become difficult to find. Nyelli stepped slightly forward. You should leave. Daniel sighed almost sadly at that. I hope we might speak like civilized people today. Elias gave a dry glance toward the two silent riders still waiting on the ridge. Most civilized men do not travel with backup. Daniel's faint smile returned. Most ranchers do not shelter fugitives carrying stolen federal evidence. Wind swept across the valley again, rattling the porch chains softly against the wood beams. Elias noticed Daniel never once raised his voice. Men like that frighten towns more effectively than loud ones. You got proof she stole anything? Elias asked. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Do you? Silence followed. Daniel looked toward Nyelli again, his pale gloves resting calmly over the saddle horn. You have 5 days because my father still believes you may hand over the pouch peacefully. Nyelli's dark eyes hardened. Your father murdered Aaron Bell. Daniel's expression did not change. Not even slightly. Deputy Bell made unfortunate choices. He tried to tell the truth. Daniel looked almost tired hearing that word. Truth. Miss Nyelli, he said quietly. Truth is simply the version of events powerful people survive long enough to write down. Elias felt something cold move through him hearing that sentence. Because the man believed it completely. Nyelli stepped forward another pace despite the dog pressing nervously against her legs. My people will never leave the canyon river. Daniel studied her silently for a moment while fog drifted across the wet fields between them. Then he reached slowly inside his coat. Elias stiffened immediately, but Daniel only removed a folded photograph protected inside oilcloth. I thought you should see this before making another brave decision. He tossed it gently into the mud near the gate. Elias picked it up first. His stomach tightened instantly. The photograph showed 6 Apache elders standing near the canyon river beside armed railroad guards. Faces exhausted, defeated. Nyelli's breath caught softly beside him. Daniel watched both of them carefully from horseback. The negotiations began yesterday, he said. Without your pouch, there is nothing left stopping the railroad claims. Nyelli stared at the photograph like the ground beneath her had suddenly vanished. Daniel placed one glove back onto his hand slowly. 5 days is generous, he said quietly. But after that, the railroad moves forward with or without mercy. Then he turned his horse calmly and rode back toward the ridge without another word while the valley